David had lived in his small neighborhood for almost 8 years. His house was not the newest, nor the largest, but it was the place he called home. When he first moved in, he dreamed of slowly making improvements to make it more comfortable. He was not the kind of person who rushed into things. Instead, he saved money carefully, step by step, so that every change would be something meaningful. One of the things that always bothered him was the old windows. They rattled when the wind blew, they leaked cold air during winter, and when rainstorms came, drops of water would sometimes sneak in. David often joked to his friends that his living room felt like it belonged in 2 seasons at once: summer outside, winter inside. But deep down, it wasn't funny. He worked from home some days, and the drafty windows made it hard to sit near his desk. During winter nights, he had to add extra blankets just to stay warm. He knew it was time for a change. For 2 years, David put aside a part of his paycheck. He skipped vacations, ate at home more often, and even gave up his habit of buying coffee from the shop down the street. Every dollar saved went into what he called the window fund. Finally, one spring, he had enough to start planning. In his neighborhood, every major change to a house had to be approved by the Homeowners Association, the HOA. That was the rule, and David respected rules. He did not want trouble. So, before hiring anyone, he carefully filled out the request form, attached samples of the new windows, and even included pictures of how the house would look once the work was done. The waiting period felt long. Each day, David checked his mailbox with a little hope. He knew some neighbors had stories about the HOA being strict, but he believed that if you followed the process, things would be fine. After 3 weeks, the envelope finally arrived. He held it in his hands for a moment before opening it. His heart beat faster as he unfolded the letter. The words were clear: approved. David let out a deep breath and smiled. All the saving, all the patience, it was worth it. He placed the letter on his kitchen table and stared at it for a while. To him, it wasn't just paper. It was a green light, a sign that he could finally fix what had been bothering him for years. He took a picture of the letter and sent it to his sister with a short message: finally, new windows coming soon. Within a week, he contacted a trusted contractor. The team visited, took measurements, and promised to finish the job within a few days once the windows arrived. David felt excited like a child waiting for a gift. He even cleaned his house more than usual, preparing for the workers. The morning the work began, David stood outside with a cup of tea, watching the team remove the old frames. Pieces of wood, dusty glass, and worn-out seals piled up quickly. It was strange to see the empty spaces where his windows used to be, but it also felt like a fresh start. As the new windows were installed, the house seemed to transform. The frames were modern but not flashy, neat but strong. Sunlight entered more cleanly, and the glass kept the noise of the street much lower. David tested one by opening and closing it. It slid smoothly without the creaking sound he had lived with for years. When the work was done, David walked through every room, looking at each window carefully. It felt like his home was breathing differently. For the first time in a long time, he felt a wave of peace inside his house. He paid the contractor with gratitude and shook his hand firmly. That night, David sat by the living room window with a warm cup of tea. Outside, the street lights glowed, and the soft hum of the neighborhood could be heard faintly. Inside, his home was quiet and warm. He wrapped a light blanket around himself but noticed he didn't really need it anymore. The cold draft was gone. As he sat there, he thought about how long he had waited for this moment. It was not just about comfort, it was about doing something right, something lasting. He had followed the rules, saved his money, and made an honest improvement to his home. He went to bed that night with a smile, believing the hardest part was over. What David did not know was that the real story had not even begun. A few weeks passed after the windows were installed, and David was still enjoying the quiet comfort of his home. The new windows had changed his daily life in ways he hadn't expected. He could sit at his desk without shivering, he could watch TV without hearing the loud traffic outside, and he no longer had to check towels along the sills after a storm. Everything felt settled and peaceful. Then one afternoon, as David returned from the grocery store, he stopped by the mailbox. Inside was a thick white envelope from the HOA. At first, he thought it might be just another newsletter or notice about landscaping schedules. He tucked it under his arm with the other letters and carried his bags inside. Later, while putting away his groceries, he casually opened the envelope. As his eyes scanned the first lines, his hands froze. He read the words again, slowly this time, making sure he wasn't mistaken. Notice of violation, non-compliant windows. Fine, $12,000. David blinked in disbelief. His mouth went dry. The words didn't make sense. Non-compliant. Fine. How could that be? He set the letter down, rubbed his eyes, and picked it up again, reading every line carefully. The HOA claimed his new windows did not match the community's approved style and therefore violated the rules. He was ordered to pay a fine of $12,000 within 30 days. For several long minutes, David sat at his kitchen table in silence. He felt his chest tighten as if the air had suddenly become heavy. His mind jumped back to the approval letter, the one he had kept safely in his desk drawer. He remembered the joy he had felt when reading the word approved. How could the same HOA that gave him permission now turn around and fine him? That night, David barely slept. He tossed and turned, replaying the situation in his head. He thought about the months he had saved money, the weeks he had waited for approval, the careful planning he had done. None of it seemed to matter now. He even began to doubt himself. Had he missed something? Had he misunderstood the letter? The next morning, determined to find answers, David pulled out the approval letter from his desk. The HOA's signature was right there at the bottom, clear and undeniable. He placed both letters, the approval and the violation, side by side on the table. The contradiction was plain. Still, a fine that large wasn't something he could ignore. He decided to visit the HOA office in person. Carrying both letters in a folder, he walked into the small brick building where the association held its meetings. The receptionist gave him a polite but tired smile and asked how she could help. David explained his situation, his voice steady but tight with frustration. "Someone needs to see this," he said, sliding the papers forward. "I got approval. Now I'm being fined. Can you explain why?" She glanced at the letters and then disappeared into a back room. After a few minutes, she returned and asked him to wait for one of the board members. David sat on a stiff chair in the corner, staring at the framed photographs of manicured lawns and neatly painted houses on the wall. His stomach churned as he waited. Finally, a man in a suit walked in and introduced himself as a board member. David repeated his story, showing the documents. The man glanced at them, adjusted his glasses, and said calmly, "This appears to be a clerical mistake. The approval you received was not valid. It should never have been given." David's jaw dropped. "Not valid? You signed it? I followed the process. How can you say it doesn't count?" The man remained cold and distant. Unfortunately, the board cannot be responsible for errors made in the approval process. The fact remains that your windows are not in compliance. The fine still stands. The words stung like a slap. David felt anger rise inside him, but he kept his voice controlled. "This isn't right," he said firmly. "I trusted this process. I did everything by the book." But the board member only repeated the same phrase, "The fine still stands." David left the office with his folder in hand, his legs heavy, his heart pounding. Outside, the sun was shining, but to him, the day felt gray. As he walked back to his car, he felt as though the walls of his own neighborhood were closing in on him. That evening, David called his sister and explained everything. She gasped in disbelief. "But you had approval. You have it in writing. How can they do this?" "I don't know," David admitted, his voice low. "But they are. And if I don't fight it, I'll be buried in debt." The stress began to seep into every part of his life. At work, he found it hard to focus. At night, he lay awake thinking about the fine, the cold words of the board member, and the heavy weight of unfairness pressing on him. He had always been a rule follower, someone who respected order, but now the very system he trusted had turned against him. Still, beneath the stress, a spark of determination flickered. He looked again at the approval letter, at the signature at the bottom. That piece of paper was his truth, his shield. He refused to give up. If the HOA wanted a battle, they were going to get one. David didn't yet know how long the fight would last, or how much it would cost him, but in that moment, one thing was clear: he would not back down. David sat at his kitchen table late into the night, the two letters spread out in front of him. One said approved, the other demanded $12,000. He kept reading them over and over, as if the answer to his problem would suddenly appear between the lines. But the truth was clear: the HOA was refusing to admit their mistake. At first, David tried to solve things peacefully. He wrote polite emails to the HOA, attaching a copy of the approval letter. He called their office during lunch breaks, hoping to reach someone who might listen. Each time, he received the same response: "The fine stands." No one showed sympathy. No one even admitted the approval letter existed, even though he had proof in black and white. The frustration grew heavier with each passing day. David felt like he was shouting into the wind. His friends and co-workers gave him advice, but most of them told him to just pay the fine. "It's not worth the fight," one said. "Just move on." But David couldn't accept that. He had done nothing wrong. Paying would mean admitting guilt when he knew he had followed every step correctly. One Saturday morning, after another restless night, David decided he needed help. He searched for local attorneys who specialized in housing and HOA disputes. The list was long, but one name kept coming up: Mr. Parker, a lawyer with 20 years of experience. Nervous but determined, David scheduled a consultation. The following week, he sat in Mr. Parker's office, clutching his folder of documents. The lawyer listened carefully as David explained everything, from the first approval letter to the violation notice. Parker flipped through the papers slowly, nodding. After a long pause, he looked up and said, "You have a strong case. This is not just unfair, it's a breach of their own process. If you're willing to fight, we can challenge them." Hearing those words lifted a weight from David's shoulders. For the first time since receiving the violation letter, he felt hope. But the relief was short-lived when Parker explained the costs. Filing the case, attending hearings, and pushing through appeals would not be cheap. Even if David won, the process could take years. David sat silently for a moment, doing the math in his head. He had already spent nearly all his savings on the windows themselves. Now he would have to dip into his emergency funds and cut back on nearly everything else. But when he imagined simply paying the fine and walking away, his stomach twisted. He knew he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he gave up. "I'll fight," David said firmly. "Whatever it takes." And so the battle began. Over the next several months, David's life was consumed by meetings, paperwork, and hearings. His evenings, once filled with quiet walks or time spent reading, were now spent at his desk, gathering evidence. He collected photos of the windows, emails he had sent, and every note from the HOA. Parker guided him through the process, preparing arguments and drafting responses to the HOA's claims. The HOA, however, did not make things easy. They hired their own legal team, and their responses were cold and defensive. They argued that the approval letter was an error and therefore invalid. They claimed David should have known better, even though he had no reason to question the signature on the document. The stress began to show. David lost weight, his appetite fading with the constant worry. He struggled to focus at work, and his boss quietly asked if something was wrong. His sister called often, urging him not to let the fight consume him, but David could not let it go. Every time he looked at the fine notice pinned to his refrigerator, he felt anger and determination rise again. There were moments when he doubted himself. Some nights, he stared at the ceiling and wondered if his friends had been right, if he should have just paid and moved on. But then he remembered the principle behind it all. If he let the HOA win, they could do the same to anyone in the neighborhood. He didn't just want justice for himself, he wanted fairness for others too. After almost a year, the case reached its first major hearing. David sat in the courtroom, nervous but steady, as Parker presented their evidence. The approval letter was displayed, signed clearly by the HOA president. The board's lawyers tried to argue again that it was a mistake, but the judge frowned. "Mistake or not," the judge said, "this is a legal document." Hearing those words gave David a spark of confidence. The road ahead was still long: appeals, delays, endless documents, but for the first time, it felt like the truth was starting to shine through. That night, David returned home exhausted but strangely calm. He stood by his new window, looking out at the streetlights, and whispered to himself, "I'm not done yet. I'm going to see this through." What he didn't know was that the fight would stretch far longer than he imagined, 5 years in total. But in that moment, one thing was certain: he would not let the HOA break him. The first year of the case had passed, and David was beginning to understand how heavy a battle like this could be. At first, he thought it would be resolved quickly. He imagined the judge would see the approval letter, declare the fine unfair, and close the case. But the HOA was stubborn, and every small victory in court was followed by another delay, another hearing, another pile of papers to sign. Each month brought new legal fees. David tried to stay calm when he saw the invoices from his lawyer, but inside he felt his stomach twist. He had already emptied his savings account, and now he was using money that he had once kept for emergencies. Vacations, hobbies, and simple pleasures like going out for dinner became impossible. Every dollar was redirected toward the fight. The stress showed up in his daily life. At work, he found it harder to concentrate. Simple tasks that used to take him an hour now stretched into 2. His manager noticed and asked if everything was all right. David would force a smile and say, "Just a little busy," but inside, he felt overwhelmed. At night, sleep became his enemy. He would close his eyes only for his mind to start replaying arguments from court or imagining worst-case scenarios. What if he lost? What if he ended up not only paying the $12,000 fine but also drowning in legal bills? The thought kept him awake, staring at the ceiling until dawn. His friends noticed the change too. They invited him out less often, not because they didn't care, but because David usually said no. He was always too tired, too stressed, or too focused on preparing documents. His world became smaller, centered only around work, court dates, and his house. Even the house itself, once his place of comfort, began to feel different. The windows he had loved so much became a symbol of his struggle. Each time he opened them, instead of feeling joy, he felt a reminder of the fight that had consumed his life. The approval letter that once made him smile now sat in a folder that he opened only with a heavy heart. His sister, Anna, tried to support him. She called often, sometimes just to listen, sometimes to encourage him to take a break. "You can't let this eat you alive, David," she would say gently. "You need to take care of yourself too." David appreciated her words, but he didn't know how to step away. The case was always on his mind. 2 years passed. Then 3. The process dragged on. Every time it seemed close to ending, the HOA would find a way to extend it: new motions, new arguments, new delays. The board seemed determined to wear him down until he gave up. But David refused. Even on his hardest days, something inside him refused to let go. When he thought about surrendering, he would pull out the approval letter again and look at the signature at the bottom. That signature was proof, a clear reminder that he was right. And being right gave him the strength to continue. Still, the toll was undeniable. His health began to suffer. He lost weight, his face grew pale, and his eyes often looked tired. He started skipping meals without noticing, too busy with stress to care about food. On some mornings, when he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. There were moments when anger boiled inside him, but more often, it was exhaustion. He longed for peace, for the simple life he had before this all began. He missed sitting by the window with tea, enjoying the quiet evening without worry. Now, even peaceful nights carried a shadow of fear about the next step in the case. 5 years stretched longer than he could have imagined. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went, seasons changed, and still the fight continued. David sometimes joked to himself that the case had lasted longer than some marriages. But behind the joke was sadness. He had lost so much time, so much energy, to something that should never have happened in the first place. Yet, through all the years, David never gave up. His lawyer told him again and again that persistence mattered, that cases like these were marathons, not sprints. "They're trying to tire you out," Parker would say. "But you've lasted this long. Don't stop now." And David didn't stop. One evening, as he sat once again by his window, watching the streetlights glow, he thought about everything he had been through. The long nights, the endless papers, the fear, the anger. But he also thought about his determination. He had stood his ground for 5 years, and that was something the HOA could never take from him. He didn't know it yet, but the turning point was near. The truth that had been buried under years of arguments was about to surface. And when it did, it would change everything. 5 years had passed since the first letter, and David sometimes wondered how he had found the strength to keep going. He had lost count of the number of hearings, the endless documents, and the times he had walked into a courtroom feeling nervous but hopeful. Yet the case never seemed to end. Then one quiet afternoon, David's phone rang. It was his lawyer, Mr. Parker. His voice carried a hint of excitement that David had never heard before. "David," Parker said, "I think we've found something important." David sat up straighter in his chair. "What is it?" "I've been going through the HOA's internal records," Parker explained. "It wasn't easy, but after repeated requests, they finally had to share certain documents. And guess what? The approval for your windows wasn't just some random mistake by an office worker. It was officially signed by the HOA president himself." For a moment, David couldn't speak. He had always believed in that letter, but to hear confirmation that the president himself had approved it felt like fresh air after years of suffocation. "You're saying the president signed it?" "The same one who told me it was a mistake?" David asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Yes," Parker replied firmly. "His signature is on multiple documents. He not only approved your request but also signed off on similar changes for other homeowners. That means they've been inconsistent. They allowed some people to do things freely while targeting you." David's heart pounded as he listened. For 5 years, he had carried the weight of doubt, constantly told by the HOA that his approval was an error. Now, the truth was out, it wasn't an error. It was real. And they had lied to him all along. When he hung up the phone, David stood by his window and looked out at the street. The glass reflected his tired face, but behind his exhaustion was a spark of determination stronger than ever. For years, the HOA had made him feel small and powerless. But now, he had proof that could finally turn the tide. The next hearing was different from the ones before. David walked into the courtroom with his head held higher. Parker presented the newly uncovered documents, laying them on the judge's desk with steady hands. The room grew quiet as everyone saw the signature of the HOA president, dated and clear. The HOA's lawyers tried to argue again. They claimed the president had been misinformed, that he hadn't realized what he was signing, that the approval was still invalid. But the judge raised an eyebrow and said, "You cannot simply dismiss an official signature. It holds weight." For the first time in years, David felt the balance shift in his favor. As the hearing ended, David walked out of the courtroom with Parker. "So, what happens now?" he asked cautiously. Parker gave him a reassuring smile. "Now we push harder. With this evidence, the HOA's position is weak. They can't hide behind excuses anymore." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. News of the case spread quietly among neighbors, and some began to approach David with their own stories. A few admitted they had also been unfairly targeted by the HOA, though most had given up without a fight. They praised David for standing firm, though he didn't feel like a hero. He was just tired but also determined to see this through. At night, David found himself thinking less about fear and more about justice. He imagined the day when he could finally breathe freely in his own home, without the shadow of the HOA looming over him. The thought gave him energy, even on the hardest days. The discovery of the signed approval didn't solve everything instantly. There were still motions to file, hearings to attend, and arguments to counter. But for David, the difference was clear. He no longer felt like he was walking in the dark. He had a light now, a weapon of truth that the HOA couldn't easily dismiss. One evening, David pulled out the original approval letter again. This time, instead of feeling pain, he felt pride. He had trusted this piece of paper for 5 years, and now it was finally being recognized for what it was: the truth. His sister called him that night, and he told her about the discovery. She gasped with relief. "I knew it, David. I knew you weren't wrong." I'm so proud you didn't give up. David smiled softly. I almost did, Anna. So many times. But now it feels like it was worth holding on. The turning point had come. The battle wasn't finished, but the tide was shifting. And for the first time in a very long time, David went to bed that night with a calm heart, whispering to himself, the truth is finally on my side. What he didn't know yet was how far that truth would carry him, or that it would soon lead to the biggest victory of his life. The courthouse felt different that morning. David had walked through its doors many times before, each time with a mix of fear and hope. But this time, there was something else in the air, a sense of finality. After 5 long years, endless hearings, and mountains of paperwork, the case was finally coming to its close. David sat beside his lawyer, Mr. Parker, waiting for the judge to arrive. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing with possibilities. What if the HOA found another excuse? What if the judge delayed the decision again? And yet, beneath the worry, there was also calm. He knew the truth was on his side now. When the judge entered the courtroom, the room grew quiet. Papers rustled, chairs creaked, but no one spoke. The judge reviewed the files in front of him, his face unreadable. Then he looked up and began to speak. This case has stretched far too long, the judge said firmly. The evidence is clear. The homeowner, David, received written approval from the HOA, signed by the president himself. The board then attempted to fine him for actions they had already approved. Such conduct is not acceptable. David felt his heart pound. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table as the judge continued. The fines are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to compensate David in the amount of $75,000 for damages, legal expenses, and the undue stress caused by this prolonged dispute. For a moment, the words didn't seem real. David blinked, almost expecting to wake up. $75,000. He turned slowly to look at Parker, who gave him a small, proud smile and a nod. You won, David, Parker whispered. The sound of those words filled David with a wave of relief so strong that tears burned his eyes. 5 years of struggle, 5 years of doubt, 5 years of sleepless nights, all of it had led to this moment. The HOA's lawyers shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale. The board members who had once spoken so confidently against him now sat silent, their arguments crushed by the weight of truth. As the session ended, David walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun. For the first time in years, the air felt light. He breathed deeply, as if he were finally free of a burden he had carried too long. A few weeks later, the check arrived. David opened the envelope slowly, his hands trembling. Inside was the piece of paper that marked the end of his battle. Written clearly across it was the amount, $75,000. And at the bottom, in neat, familiar handwriting, was the signature of the HOA president, the same man who had once dismissed David, the same man who had insisted his approval didn't matter. David stared at the signature for a long time. Life had a strange way of turning things around. Years earlier, that same man had signed the approval letter for David's windows, then later claimed it was meaningless. Now, he had signed another paper, one that admitted defeat and handed David the justice he deserved. David didn't cheer, he didn't laugh, and he didn't gloat. Instead, he felt something far deeper, peace. He quietly placed the check on his kitchen table, next to the old approval letter he had kept all these years. The two papers told the story of his journey, the beginning and the end. That evening, David sat by his living room window, the same place he had sat so many nights filled with worry. But this night was different. The glass was clear, the air inside was warm, and the weight in his chest was gone. He held a cup of tea in his hands and simply watched the street lights glow. His sister called to congratulate him. "You did it, David. You really did it?" David smiled. "It wasn't easy. But it was worth it. You stood your ground when everyone else told you to give up," she said proudly. David thought about that. It was true, he could have surrendered at any time. He could have paid the fine, avoided the stress, and walked away. But then, the HOA would have won by unfairness. He realized that his persistence wasn't just for himself, it was also for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly and thought they had no choice but to stay silent. That night, before going to bed, David placed the check safely in a folder. But to him, the money was not the true reward. The real reward was the knowledge that he had endured, that truth had prevailed, and that justice had been served. As he turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, he glanced one last time at his windows. They stood tall and shining, not just as home improvements but as symbols of his resilience. The fight was finally over. Victory was his. After 5 long years, the fight with the HOA was finally over. David sat by his living room window in the quiet evening, the glow of the street lights outside reflecting on the glass. His house, once a source of stress and frustration, now felt like a sanctuary. The windows he had fought for stood bright and strong, letting in the soft light of the fading sun. The $75,000 check rested safely in a folder on the kitchen table, a symbol of his victory, but David didn't focus on the money. He had learned that the true value was not in the financial compensation. It was in the knowledge that he had stood his ground, had followed the rules, and had refused to surrender when others told him to give up. David leaned back in his chair and thought about the years he had lost to worry, stress, and endless paperwork. The nights when sleep wouldn't come, the days when work felt impossible, and the weekends he spent preparing for hearings instead of enjoying life with friends. All of that had been painful. But in retrospect, it had shaped him in ways nothing else could. He thought about the moments when he almost gave up. There had been evenings when he stared at the approval letter, tears in his eyes, feeling defeated. The thought of paying the $12,000 fine just to move on had been tempting. Many of his friends and neighbors had told him the same thing. "Why waste your energy? Just pay it and forget it," they had said. But David knew that giving up would have left him with regret far heavier than any fine. The lesson was clear: persistence matters. Standing up for what is right, even when it seems impossible, is worth the struggle. He had learned that rules are only as fair as the people who enforce them, and that sometimes, systems can fail. But even when systems fail, the truth does not disappear. It takes courage, patience, and unwavering determination to let it shine. David also realized the value of support. His sister, Anna, had been his anchor throughout the years. Her constant calls, gentle reminders to take care of himself, and words of encouragement had helped him stay grounded. Without her, the long journey might have been even harder. He understood now that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, it is a source of strength. As he looked at his windows, David smiled. They were more than glass and frames, they were symbols of endurance, reminders that he had fought for his home and his rights. He remembered the first day he had held the approval letter, imagining the warm, peaceful home he had longed for. And now, looking around his house, he saw that he had not only achieved comfort but also justice. The HOA president's signature on the check was a final touch of irony. The same man who had dismissed him for years, insisting the approval didn't matter, had been forced to acknowledge David's victory. It was a quiet reminder that sometimes, the people who challenge us most are the ones who teach us the most important lessons about resilience, patience, and the value of truth. In the following weeks, life slowly returned to normal. David took time to enjoy the simple pleasures he had missed during the fight. He made small dinners without thinking about court documents, went for walks in the neighborhood, and even took a short trip he had postponed for years. The money from the settlement helped restore his savings, but it did not change the most important thing, his sense of personal victory. David also shared his experience with neighbors, quietly advising them on how to handle disagreements with the HOA and encouraging them to follow rules carefully while standing firm when treated unfairly. He realized that his story could help others, not as a warning, but as proof that perseverance can overcome injustice. One quiet evening, David sat again by the living room window, a cup of tea in hand, and watched the sunset. The streets were calm, the air smelled of evening grass, and for the first time in years, his mind was peaceful. He reflected on the journey, the struggles, and the triumphs. He understood now that the battle had not been about money, fines, or even windows. It had been about integrity, patience, and believing in what is right. He whispered softly to himself, "It was never just about the windows. It was about standing up for myself, and for what is fair." As the sun dipped below the horizon, David felt a deep sense of closure. The pain, stress, and sleepless nights were behind him. He had learned lessons that no money could buy: the power of persistence, the importance of support, and the satisfaction of seeing justice prevail. And with that, David finally allowed himself to relax fully, knowing that he had faced an enormous challenge, had endured, and had come out stronger on the other side. His home, his peace of mind, and his integrity were intact. He had fought, he had waited, and now he had learned the greatest lesson of all: patience, courage, and truth always matter.